Okay. So I want to thank Erin Taylor and Diana McCalmemt for joining us today. They're going to be talking about developmental disabilities, and for those who aren't here, it is being recorded, and we will be putting that on the YouTube page, which I will post in the chat. So I want to thank both of our speakers so much for being here. I'm really looking forward to hearing the history and just the information about developmental disabilities. So with that, Erin, I'll let you introduce yourself and take it away.
Okay. Hi guys, I'm Erin Taylor, and I'm really excited to be working with you guys. I earned my PhD many years ago, and if I could still go back to college, I would. I just was never meant to graduate or get a real job, but I do have a real job, and that is I'm the parent advocate and the public policy person at the Oklahoma Developmental Disabilities Council. Now that may sound like you, that's an office at DHS that serves people, but we're not. We have offices at DHS, but I'm really part of the federal government. The federal government passed a law called the Developmental Disabilities Act, which provides protections for people with developmental disabilities and also funding so that every state has certain agencies. One agency is a research center, which we call our USED, and ours is at the OU Health Science Center, and that's for research and excellence in developmental disabilities. There's my agency. We do advocacy and training. My job is to custom make training for whoever needs it in the state and go out and provide that at no charge. And then I also work in public policy, which means I spend a lot of time at the state capitol working with legislators on different issues. And I'm going to talk about the training in a minute. And the last one that you need to know about is our Disability Law Center. Every state also has a Disability Law Center, and their job is to protect the civil rights of people with developmental disabilities. They don't handle criminal cases, but they do the civil rights. So those are agencies you should definitely know about. I want to be clear, first of all, what a developmental disability is, because most people that I encounter from the public didn't know there were flavors of disability, right? Well, there's acquired disabilities and there are developmental disabilities. The developmental disability at its most simple definition is a disability you were born with or acquired by your 22nd birthday. And that's important because if you were a soldier in Iraq and you had a blast injury and you were 20 years old, you now have a developmental disability because it means you simply weren't done growing and maturing. And let's think about 20-year-old men, not done growing and maturing, right? And that it's going to impact your life forever on. So people with developmental disabilities have a significant delay or problems in certain areas. It may be financial independence. It may be self-care. It may be mobility. It may be cognition skills like reading or things like that. And these are people you're going to have the great opportunity to work with and advocate and all of that stuff. So a lot of my work is dealing with parents when they first get the diagnosis. And I know what that's like. My third child, who was born in 2002, so he's almost 19 now, was born with a condition called hypoplastic left heart syndrome, which just sounds like really fancy Tupperware, but it's not. It means he was missing an entire chamber in his heart. And so when he was born, he immediately went to surgery, and he had 8 open heart surgeries and a heart transplant by the age of 5. And I thought that was the hardest thing we were ever going to go through, and I was very scared, and it was traumatic. But then the doctors had to tell me, it turns out that because he didn't have enough oxygen those first 5 years of his life, because his heart wasn't working well, and because he had so many surgeries, which heart surgery can create brain injuries if it's very intensive heart surgery, and because your son has had heart attacks and strokes, he now has a significant brain injury. And so at the age of 6, when we had just gotten over all that, we started learning about what it means to have a kid with an intellectual disability. And I was terrified because I'd spent all my life working in higher education. I only liked smart people. And I only saw the value in people who I thought were very intelligent and smart and achieved a whole lot. I wasn't prepared to have somebody with a disability in my classroom, let alone be competent enough to raise them. But Henry got me through it. Henry raised me. He did a great job. And today he's 18, and he, it's like any other 18-year-old boy. He eats too much and he smells funky, and he's constantly in my refrigerator. And we're making decisions about what we're going to do after high school. And he's a great kid. I have 5 children, and he's by far my easiest to handle. But he has a significant intellectual disability. On paper, his IQ is a 46. To his teachers, he has the literacy level of a kindergartner at 4 years old. But that's such a small way. That's such a small way to see a kid. For example, if we judged all of you by your ability to land the space shuttle, how many of you would be brilliant? Right? It just depends on what you're evaluated by. Henry's really kind. He's wickedly funny. He's kind of has a sarcastic, dry sense of humor. He's pretty savvy about people. He knows who to trust and not to trust. So, think about that when you have encounters with people with developmental disabilities. You're not going to get the immediate image from test scores and reports. At my work, and one of the most important things I did before I came to work here was I took a class called Partners in Policymaking. We still offer that now, and Diana was my instructor. Partners in Policymaking is a 9-month disability advocacy class. If you think that your interest is working with families where somebody has a disability, I really very much encourage you to take this. I know you're very busy now with school, but this would be something you do when you graduate. It's entirely free to you. It's mainly online. It's 1 weekend a month, and you will meet with the nation's best educators on disability issues. Not me, the nation's best educators. So, for example, you'll have topics on Social Security, IEPs, violence and abuse, sexuality, getting involved politically, how to start a grassroots organization, and all of that. So if you are interested in that, you can stay in touch with me. Jennifer can tell you how, or she can put my contacts up. And also our website, which is okddc.ok.gov. And there's a video there about our class and some more information, including the application. So that is what I do for a living. I'm going to let you guys ask a couple of questions. Then I'm going to let Diana speak because her story is so fascinating. I don't want to take any time from her. So what questions do you have maybe about disabilities or our work or things like that? I can tell you I work a lot with social workers. I can tell you that I also took a class at the OU Health Science Center that all of you would be eligible to take called, it's from the Child Abuse Center, Child Center for Abuse and Neglect. And it's a national research center. But this class is really amazing. 9 months of learning how abuse and neglect happens, how we investigate it, what the pitfalls are, and all of that. And that was the time where I spent the most with social workers. And I realized you guys are not prepared by your studies to be able to work with a lot of disability issues. And yet, a majority of children who end up in foster care have some level of child abuse, neglect, and a developmental delay or disability. And so you're going to see those kids. It's hard to deal with a situation when you're going in and the child is 6 years old and maybe nonverbal. Or you're going in and the parents are saying, this child is schizophrenic and he's awful and he's hideous, but you suspect he has autism. So that's a lot of the ways I see social workers.
So I have a question. And I'm in the disability sphere, so I had always learned that developmental disabilities were congruent with cognitive or developmental delays. And it sounds like that's not true. Can you talk about that a little bit?
It's mostly true, But I'll tell you, if you have a kid that's born with CP, cerebral palsy, and they have no brain injury factor to it, there's no cognition, that child still has a developmental disability, but it's not impacting intellectual function. You know, children who are born with a leg length discrepancy or epilepsy and all that, it might have no intellectual impact whatsoever. But the kids that we're spending a lot of our focus, time, and resources on are kids with autism and Down syndrome and things like that. You know, most kids with autism are not born with that diagnosis. They get to 2, 3, 4 years old before that happens.
Okay. So I'm just curious too, what kind of issues do you see in these families?
I will tell you the issue that I see the most is that parents discount their children too soon and too quickly. Now, I don't think you should go in when a mom's just received a frightening diagnosis and say, don't worry, it'll be all fine. Every parent needs their season to process their feelings. And it took me probably 3 or 4 years to come to terms with the fact that my kid had an intellectual disability. I think that there's a lot of stress in the amount of work that comes with it. It's not that the child is difficult, it's that raising a child in this culture is difficult. So I always say, if you want to be a parent of a child with a disability, you have to be very, very good at paperwork. That's the number one skill you need. It's a lot of meeting with therapists and paperwork and doctors and specialists until you kind of get to a space where you say, maybe I don't need all this. Maybe I just need to let him be a kid. And we really hope we can get some parents there.
Great, thank you. Brittany, Christine, do you guys have any questions?
Okay, so Christy, are you working now?
Me, no.
Okay. What about Christy? Are you working now? Or what are your ambitions? Let me ask that.
Yes, I am actually an instructor and field liaison at OU. So I'm the advisor for SWSA.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I'm
then
just
you know,
here.
you know Jennifer Dell.
Yes.
Yes, she's a good friend of mine, and we've gone to church many, many years together. Yep.
Yes, she works in Norman. I'm on the Tulsa campus.
Okay.
And with planning the professional development week for April coming up, I've gotten a chance to work with her closely. So she's awesome.
Yeah, she's great.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
you want to let Diana go?
Sure. And I would love it if you could email me those resources you talked about so we could get that out
and
to the
I am going to step off of here at like 12:35. Okay. Thanks, guys.
Okay. Thank you so much for speaking with us. Diana, if you could just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your experience, I will let you take it away.
Sure, thanks. I'm Diana McCalmemt, and as Erin said, for many, many years, I was a contractor at the Developmental Disabilities Council and taught or facilitated the Partners in Policymaking program. But my involvement with developmental disabilities goes back to 1968 when my son David was born. David was my first child. I was 20 years old, and David was born with Down syndrome. And so over the years, of course, that was before 94-142 public law, which required an education for children. So David and I and my husband cobbled together educational programs and preschools and that sort of thing for many years. And my husband was in the Navy, and we retired and came back to Oklahoma, which was his home. And we were living in Bixby, and I was actually teaching in Bixby. I was already a special education teacher when David was born, which is atypical. You find lots of parents of children with disabilities who are special ed teachers, but typically they resort to that as a means of understanding the system after the children are born. And unlike that, I was already teaching special ed when David was born. So as I understand what Jennifer wants me to talk to you about is the experience of institutionalization. And I'm sure you all are aware that there are now no longer any state-run institutions in Oklahoma. The last two institutions were closed. I've got to look on my date here. Hang on a minute. Erin can probably cite it from memory, but I had to keep it written down. November 5th of 2012 was the final closure of the last two institutions. And actually, those two institutions, Enid and Paul's Valley, which were then, that was their original names. At the time of closure, they were called Sork and Norse. They were actually the two oldest institutions. The institution that I was most familiar with, state-run, was HISM. And HISM was established in 1964. And it was the crown jewel in the Oklahoma Department of Human Services crown. It was a brand new facility, built state of the art, and heads and shoulders above the two older institutions. And so I actually didn't know very much about HISM until 1978, late in the year or early in 1979. David had been attending school in an educable mentally handicapped class. Excuse the language, but I'm going back years and that was acceptable language at the time. And he had been attending a class in Bixby and I was teaching at the junior high, special education. And we were informed close to the end of the school year that David was 10. And so he would be transitioning into the intermediate class instead of the primary class. But Bixby decided not to have an intermediate class. And at that time, school systems did not have to provide education. At their school system, they could co-op with other school districts. So one school district could have an educable primary class, another school district could have an educable intermediate class, and you could move your children from district to district to find the appropriate class, which sounds pretty easy, except there were 6 of us at home, that is 6 kids at home. And I was teaching, and the class that David would be able to attend was going to be in Jenks. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with the logistics of Jenks and Bixby. They're not very far, but they're also not very close. And so the support given by the school system was that they would pay me mileage to drive David to school and back. They would not provide bus transportation. But there was this little problem of my job in the way because I couldn't keep teaching and drive David to Jenks and leave him for the day and go back and get him. And so we realized pretty quickly that we had to find another solution. And at that time, the only other solution was to send David to HISM. And so at 11 years of age, actually it was 10, we made application and we were pretty much ensured that it would be 3 or 4 years before there would be an available place for him. And yet less than 6 weeks later, there was a place available for him. And so we started the process to place David in HISM. And at the time, in order to do that, most of the young people, the children who were at HISM, were either abandoned by their families or were taken into custody as a ward of the state because of abuse or neglect. So we were a little bit different. We were making the choice for educational reasons, not because we were unable to care for him at home anymore. And so we did, even though it was not required, I mean, we didn't have to put him there, it was a choice. We still had to relinquish our parental rights to do so because the system that the state used to pay for HISM was that all of the children there were wards of the state, and therefore their federal benefits would come to HISM, and that's how they operated the facility, was on the benefits of all of the children. So when I took David to enroll him, actually to leave him, I was pretty much unprepared, although I had been told, and I had signed the documents, that I would not get to see David for 6 weeks or talk to him, because at that time, the thinking was that it was best to make a complete break with your child. And so I could call and find out if he was okay, but I couldn't talk with him and we couldn't visit him. And I watched him walk down the hallway at HISM hand in hand with a person I didn't know. And I didn't know, because they didn't allow you to tour the facility before you placed your child. I didn't know where he would sleep. I didn't know where he would eat. I didn't know what his day or his night would look like. And it was one of the most terrifying moments of my entire adult life, to turn over your child and have no idea where they're going. Long before Enid and Paul's Valley closed, most of those issues had been remedied. We realized it was certainly not best practice, and parents were not forced to do what my husband and I did. But I think it's significant to you as social workers that the only contact I had with David in those first 6 weeks was a letter that was written for him by his social worker. And I still have that letter because that was the only contact I had with him. So, and I was pretty sure that she actually understood him and that he did dictate the letter, because he named our pets and talked about the other brothers and sisters with nicknames that she would not have known from the records. None of that would have been available in what she had. So I'm pretty convinced that as many years ago as that was, the social worker was the one link I had to my child for 6 weeks. So don't ever underestimate your importance in the life of a family. So David was at HISM from 1979 to 1990. And I looked that up yesterday and I thought, my gosh, that was his whole life. I should have told you, David passed away in 1997 of pancreatic cancer. And so I'm not intimately involved anymore in the world of disabilities in Oklahoma. And it sort of took me aback to realize that he was there for 11 years. That's from the time he was 11 until he was 22. And I thought, wow, that was way longer than it seemed like in my memory now. But at any rate, in 1985, there were a group of 7 parents who became dissatisfied with the services at HISM. And they formed a not-for-profit group called Homeward Bound. And initially, their goal was to improve the services at HISM, but it grew past that and it became a class action lawsuit to actually close the facility. And there were that group of 7 parents and a few others who were extremely dissatisfied, but there were also roughly 500 more, because at the time there were about 600 at HISM. Most other parents were terrified that the institution might be closed because they had no idea what the options would be. I mean, those kids were there because they needed medical care, or they were unable to, parents were elderly and unable to care for them anymore. And if the institution closed at that time in Oklahoma, there were no other options. You either kept your children at home or you put them in an institution. There were probably 4 or 5 group homes, but certainly not a system vibrant enough to manage the 600 people that would be leaving the institution. So there were some 500 of us as parents and guardians who formed another group that were trying to convince the court to develop community services, but not to remove the option of HISM as a service provider. But the judge ultimately decided that the institution did need to be closed. And in 1990, a consent decree was signed between the state of Oklahoma and the court, and HISM was effectively closed. And so over the next 3 to 5 year period, I was named to a panel to develop what is now the community-based services in Oklahoma. They have changed over the years. I like to think, hopefully, for the better. Erin mentioned earlier that you come to a point in your life where you wonder if you shouldn't just let your child be a child instead of all of the therapy and additional issues. I think the judge wanted everyone at HISM to have absolutely everything. And so far more than what they needed was probably thrust on many of us. But we learned as we went along. I guess the thing that I would say most to you about the experience of institutionalization is that leaving an institution does not make you a member of the community. You can be every bit as isolated in the community as people thought they were at HISM. And that doesn't just work with people with developmental or intellectual disabilities. That's true. I see it pervasive now with people who are in mental health facilities, people who are returned from institutions, correctional institutions. The fact that you go back into the community does not mean that you're integrated into the community. You can be just as institutionalized in an apartment as you were in a medical facility or in an institution for developmental disabilities or in a correctional facility. So the fact that you move into the community and that you as social workers are often a lifeline or a bridge for those people and families who are moving back from rigid, structured facility life. I don't want you to presume that moving is equal to being integrated. And being integrated is a much, much, much more difficult step than moving from an institutional setting to a community. And so your jobs and what I wished we had had as social workers at the time were people who understood better how to reach out into a normal world and build bridges and find gatekeepers, people who would comprehend individuals' needs and their hunger to be accepted in the community, and find ways to build those bridges. Because the people who came out of HISM, it took years before they were community members, and some still are not. Of course, they're all aging and there are fewer and fewer of them, and at some point there will no longer be survivors of HISM. So it's a lesson that I hope you will learn. And I want to point you to a video that was put together several years ago. It's called OK Wagons, the number 2 waivers. OK Wagons 2 waivers, waivers.com. Don't put the www in front of it. Just type okwagons2waivers.com. Reba McEntire, who even though you're very much younger, I'm sure you know she's a very famous Oklahoma musician and songwriter, had a cousin, I believe it was, who had developmental disabilities, and Reba narrated this history of developmental disability services in Oklahoma. And I highly recommend, if you're interested in the development of the systems that we have today, where Oklahoma was when we started with people with developmental disabilities and where we are as a community today, that's an excellent video to watch. And it comes in segments, so you don't have to sit down and spend an hour and a half all at once, but it's very informative, I think. So if you're interested in that history at all, I highly recommend it to you.
Diana,
So,
can I add something?
Sure.
I just want to say, because I have to get off of here, that, you know, there are children still being raised in institutional settings and adults in institutional settings now in Oklahoma. Just because we've closed the public institutions doesn't mean they're not institutions. And there's certainly a push in some circles, including at the legislature, to reopen institutional-like settings. And we think that we do a better job of it now. But not long ago, I was in an institution down at Paul's Valley, and they were taking me on a tour of the kitchen, and they were very, very proud of the kitchen. And they said, yeah, every morning people get to come in here and choose what they want to have for breakfast. I was like, oh, is it, you know, like an omelet bar or things like that? And they said, no, there are 3 types of cereal. Every day people get to make a choice. But that's a perfect example. Options are not the same thing as choice. And all too often, people with developmental disabilities are given trite options. Would you like to go to Walmart or Brahms today for your outside excursion? So really try to think about how we can put choice in people's life. And I'm going to sign off, but I sent Jennifer my contacts. Thank you, guys.
Love you, babe. Bye.
I love you.
So I'm open to any questions you would like to ask me.
So I'm just curious, what resources are even out there? I mean, I know about some group homes and sheltered workshops, but what kind of community programs are out there?
So there are several different waivers now, and actually I've lost the one who knows more about it than I do anymore, since I'm not directly involved, but Medicaid pays for staff to live in homes with people or to come into their homes or apartments for certain periods of time every day to help them do critical life skills or support them in monetary, if they are not good with math and need help with a checkbook or money, that sort of thing. When the community system was set up in Oklahoma, it was set up originally so that every person who was in HISM, because that's the only people who were being served, mind you, the rest of the people weren't originally. So the first waiver was just for HISM residents, and none of them could live with more than one other person from HISM. So you couldn't have 3 people share an apartment, which is not an unusual thing. I mean, you know, when we go to college, lots of us, 3, 4, 5 people in a house, that's not unusual, but that was not available for HISM residents. Now I think people have more choice in the number of roommates that they have, but none of the service providers, none of the agencies who provide supports for people with disabilities in Oklahoma are allowed to own the homes. So the home is either purchased or rented by the individual with a disability. And then they choose their staff. They choose the agency that's going to support them. The reason the system was designed that way was so that if there was a problem and the staff weren't gelling with the individual, it wasn't the individual that had to move. It was the individual's home, and they stayed there and new staff came in to support them. So I think that was one thing that Oklahoma did do correctly, so that we weren't constantly shuffling the people. We were leaving them in their homes and finding the right people to provide their service. So, and that is still pretty much in play. There are several different waivers that we have different requirements to meet in order to be served by that waiver. And there are some in-home supports. So people who can live still with their families, but receive certain services from these provider agencies. It's a complicated and, well, like Erin said, you got to be an A student in paperwork to get through the whole thing. But all of those services are available if you can get on the waiver. But there's currently a waiting list of over 6,000 people in Oklahoma waiting to get on that waiver, which is just unconscionable. And it has been worse. We've had as many as 8,000.
Wow. So I'm curious also, how has the pandemic affected these resources and services? Do you know?
I don't know, but I'm guessing that it probably hasn't been any more significant. People are living in their homes with support staff, would be very similar to what you would have in a nursing home, I think, or with home health, for example. People are pretty familiar with that, with seniors who have people coming in their home to help them. Certainly people were more isolated because you couldn't leave your home. But I have to tell you, unfortunately, I don't think that's an anomaly with people with intellectual disabilities. They're largely isolated anyway, and their best friends are the people they pay to be their staff supports. So I think maybe it's not been as big an issue. I wish it had been a bigger issue, I guess, you know.
Can you talk about the school piece? We have a lot of students who are thinking about going into school social work, and I don't, maybe you can speak a little bit about that.
So at HISM, they actually did not provide the school services. There was a school on the campus, but Sand Springs Public Schools funded those classes. And so during the early days and during the institutional days, the school work was provided on campus. Of course, over the years, that's changed. And now, hopefully, no parent is forced to make the choice that my husband and I had to make because there were no other options. I think that special education continues to be underfunded and misunderstood. I think that special ed classrooms now are largely, I hope, a thing of the past, and people with disabilities and intellectual disabilities are being integrated into the classrooms with supports that are necessary for them to succeed at their level. Certainly, education has changed immensely. However, I still know that there are struggles to get adequate services because services they have to be individualized. And so getting the necessary supports for your child sometimes puts you in an adversarial position with the school system. Understanding the law and understanding the power of IEPs, I cannot stress enough how important it is for parents to recognize what their rights and what their responsibilities are as far as creating a successful educational environment for their children. And I think that the more people in the school systems, including social workers, who understand the benefits of an IEP that is written specifically. Of course, they say they're all written specifically for the child, but they're not. Understanding how critical writing that IEP is. I just wish all social workers had a chance to experience the IEP system and understand it better, because I think they could be tremendous advocates for the parent. Usually when it's IEP time, the parent sits alone, and it's all the school professionals who are there trying to tell you why they can't or don't want to do what you feel is most necessary for your child. And I think if the school social worker were informed well enough, that she could be, or he could be, a tremendous support to those parents. And so that's why I'm encouraged to see you all here today, because it's important, and you have a role to play, whether you're in the school system or whether you're in the community. I have a dear friend recently with a disability who was hospitalized, and the hospital social workers, we would have been lost. She would have been lost if that social worker had not taken the time to understand her specific needs and how she communicated. And so I don't know what branch of social work you could ever choose now that you wouldn't be at some point involved with a person who has an intellectual or developmental disability. So I should say that now we even have universities who are doing post high school programs for individuals with developmental disabilities. And so we're very proud to have seen it move that far.
Yes, I believe OU is actually one of those institutions. So there you go. Thank you so much for all your information. If nobody else has any questions, we will say goodbye. And thank you so much for telling us about your experience. I think this was really impactful. There isn't a lot of information out there about people with disabilities. So we so appreciate you coming and talking to us.
Well, I was glad to do it. Good luck to all of you. I wish you all the best.
Right, thank you.